Look with me at Romans 1, verse 21. Because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. Verse 21 says, when they knew God. What some Bible commentators will say is that's a reference to the Tower of Babel. That, in other words, there was a point in time which men knew God, and then they rejected that knowledge. Look with me at Genesis 11, verse 6. Genesis 11, verse 6. Now, Genesis 11 is about the Tower of Babel. So, Genesis 11, 6. And the Lord said, behold, the people is one, and they have all one language. And this they begin to do. And now nothing will be restrained from them, which they have imagined to do. And so you can see what folks, here, their logic is, Romans 1:21 talks about people becoming vain in their imaginations. And Genesis 11:6 talks about the issue of nothing being restrained from what man imagined to do. So what some will say is Romans 1:21, that's a historical reference to the Tower of Babel. But notice something with me. Get Genesis 6, verse 5. Genesis 6 is before the flood even happens. And God saw that the wickedness of man was great in the earth, and that every imagination of the thoughts of his heart was only evil continually. It's a pretty strong condemnation, isn't it? Isn't what you're often told today, well, what you just need to do is use your imagination? Well, if every imagination of the thoughts of the heart is evil, then that's not really great advice, is it? Wouldn't seem to be. Well, you say, well, Genesis 6 is before the flood. The flood fixed that. Get Genesis 8, verse 21. Genesis 8, verse 21. And the Lord smelled a sweet savor, and the Lord said in his heart, I will not again curse the ground any more for man's sake, for the imaginations of man's heart is evil from his youth. Neither will I again smite any more every living thing as I have done. You can see based upon these verses, I don't believe that Romans 1:21 is a specific reference to the Tower of Babel. I just don't think it is, because man's imagination was a problem a long time before the Tower of Babel. Now, before I get to what I think is going on here, I want you to notice something. Genesis 8:21 says this, for the imagination of man's heart is evil from his what? Youth. That's the explanation for why the teen years are a problem. Because you go through this transition from childhood to youth, and as a youth, here's the problem you have. You are realizing every imagination of the thoughts of my heart is only evil continually. Well, would that be kind of a big and disturbing revelation in your life? Might you then go through a series of struggles in the process of coming to adulthood, in the process of how do I relate to other people, when you realize, you know, here's what people think. Sometimes I do bad things, but I have a good heart. No, 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 and no. Right? Every imagination of the thoughts of the heart is only evil continually. That's why the teenagers are a problem. That's why adolescence is a problem. It's Genesis 8:21. Okay. Get with me Mark 9:42. Let's understand what's going on here. Mark chapter 9 and verse 42. So while you're turning there, I'm going to read Romans 1:21 again. Romans 1:21 says this, because that when they knew God, they glorified him not as God, neither were thankful, but became vain in their imaginations, and their foolish heart was darkened. I don't think that verse is a reference to a singular historical event at the Tower of Babel or elsewhere, I think that verse is a description of the natural human maturation process. That, in other words, what happens with each individual is they know God, and you know what they do? They choose to glorify Him not as God. And when they do that, they're not thankful. And what happens to their imaginations? They become vain. Here's what it's like. If you're working a long math problem, complicated one, and you make an error in line number 2, what happens to every subsequent calculation? All the subsequent calculations are wrong because you got the first thing wrong. Well, what happens to a human being when they reject the knowledge of God? You mess up every other aspect of your life because you're rejecting the most fundamental truth about the universe and how you are to relate to your Creator. Look with me at Mark 9, verse 42. And whosoever shall offend one of these, now notice this, little ones that believe in me. Now you can decide this for yourself. I think every child starts out a theist. They believe in God because it's more than obvious He exists. Everything we read so far about God making it manifest in them, being understood by the things that are made. God hath showed it to them. Every small child, you know what they start out with? They start out with the knowledge of God. But you know what they get to decide? They get to decide as they go through life whether or not they want to hold on to that knowledge, whether they want to reject it. But they all start out believing in me. Look with me at Luke 24, verse 25. See, what happens to man is he has knowledge of God, but he chooses whether or not to glorify Him. And what Romans 1:21 talked about is when they become vain in their imaginations, their foolish heart was darkened. So look with me at Luke 24, verse 25. Luke 24:25. Then He said unto them, O fools, notice this, and slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have spoken. This is my opinion, you decide for yourself. When someone is a fool, what happens is they're slow of heart to believe what God has spoken. The Bible has errors. In the original language, it means such and such. There's a million different ways it's phrased, but what it all comes down to is this. What men frequently choose to do is they choose in their heart not to believe the Word of God. And what happens as a result of that, they're vain in their imagination and their foolish heart is darkened, according to verse 21. Get Romans 1:22. Romans chapter 1 and verse 22. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools. So men profess to be wise, but they become fools. What's curious to me is that teachers at the highest level of education are called professors. And what they do is they profess, they assert to be knowledgeable in certain areas. And often they do have knowledge in those areas. But I'll say this, no matter how much knowledge you acquire in a certain worldly wisdom, because that's what professors do, right? What they do is they acquire knowledge in a specific field, and it could be business or engineering or medicine or law or whatever, and they become an expert in that field. If you acquire a wealth of knowledge in that field and you still end up in the lake of fire, you're not very wise. Isn't the most rational, basic thing you should do as a human being to solve the problem of your eternal destination? What shall it profit a man if he shall gain the world, yet lose his soul? And so what happens to man all the time is he professes to be wise. He professes to acquire knowledge of the world and understanding of things, but if he rejects the knowledge of God, he is by definition a fool, and his end is miserable. It cannot be any other way.